6 years after the release of Breath of the Wild, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is finally here. And by any measure, it's one of the most highly anticipated video games of all time. So even though I normally don't play many modern releases, I'm a huge Zelda fan, so I had to get my hands on this one and give it a try. In this video, I'll give you all my impressions of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all from the perspective of a retro gaming fanatic. I'll let you know especially if it still captures the old school spirit of Zelda, and point out the one aspect of Tears of the Kingdom that really surprised me. But before I do that, please like the video and subscribe to my channel for loads of retro gaming content. The first thing I need to point out is that Nintendo has carefully marketed Tears of the Kingdom as a true sequel to Breath of the Wild, and I'm sure glad they did this, because it uses the same mechanics, animations, controls, and graphical engine. It's stylistically similar in almost every way, so if fans went into this game expecting something completely fresh, they probably would have been disappointed. That's not to say nothing's been changed or added, because honestly, a lot has been. But it doesn't really reinvent the series or innovate in the same way as, say, Wind Waker did. For Breath of the Wild fans, I think this is going to be a great experience, but old school fans may be drawn away to some extent. So I absolutely agree with those that say a lot hinges upon whether you like Breath of the Wild. The biggest thing I think you need to know about this game concerns its building mechanics. A huge part of this title revolves around solving environmental obstacles through engineering. You'll need to build boats, carts, and other contraptions with the help of Link's new magical arm. So yeah, I guess you could say this thing makes you the Magneto of Hyrule. You're able to pick up and manipulate all sorts of objects and use them to your advantage. It's called Ultra Hand, and you'll need it to sort out all sorts of things in creative ways. The unfortunate thing is that it's really easy to lose some of the items you pick up if they fall off cliffs or get lost in other ways. So if you aren't extremely careful, it's easy to get frustrated with it. In fact, that's probably an understatement. I can even see some players giving up on this game entirely after a few unfortunate losses. The crazy thing is that you can even mess yourself up if the angle of a single fan is misaligned even by the slightest amount. The plus to this is that the game seems to allow for many different methods to circumvent these obstacles, meaning that there isn't a single end-all be-all solution to every objective. There's also a nifty ability called Recall you can use on objects to rewind them to an earlier period in time, which really helps with correcting your mistakes. For all of its downsides, it's pretty apparent that the development team put a lot of careful work into the Ultra Hand system. The controls work pretty well for it, and it utilizes a snapping system of sorts where two objects connect together when they're brought close to each other. Even though it isn't my favorite part of the game, I have to admit it's fairly user-friendly. And if you're a fan of games where you're constantly building things like Minecraft, I think you'll catch on to it and enjoy it right away. There's also a mechanic called Fuse where Link can combine objects to weapons and shields to enhance them in various ways. This can be used to do things like imbue arrows with unique elemental abilities, attach boulders to your sword to smash through rock walls, and even merge Zonai objects with weapons to make them super powerful. Just like in Breath of the Wild, there is a weapon degradation system, and basic weapons that aren't fused with anything will break pretty easily. And I have to admit I'm not a big fan of the broken weapon system, because I always liked the classic Zelda idea of always having an item once you find it, but there are ways around this. The big dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom are called temples, and these serve a similar purpose to the dungeons in the Zelda games of yore. They all contain several floors, puzzles, enemies, and in the end, a boss fight, and usually revolve around a particular ability you'll need to make use of. Also, the order in which you complete these temples is significant, and it can actually make it a lot easier to complete the others. In the Fire Temple, for instance, you have to open 5 locks in any order you choose, but you can use a special ability you acquired in the Water Temple to make quick work of the enemies within. The game doesn't really steer you in the optimal order per se, but being able to tackle the 4 elemental temples in any order you choose gives you the freedom of choice, which was always a great part of the classic Zelda games. I generally thought the temple designs were superb, especially because they aren't linear. You can explore them at will, and you can usually complete the objectives in any order you choose. These dungeons were where the true magic of the old school Zelda experience still shines through. It's true that the puzzles are far more complex, and the usage of special items is replaced to some extent with Ultra Hand and Fuse, but I felt that there was enough of the essence of the series to truly enjoy it, even from an old school perspective. And there's honestly something to be said for that, especially given that this game is so different and so many years removed from the Zelda games of the past I love so much. I also loved how intense and multi-dimensional many of the bosses were. The bosses felt like huge epic fights, and many of them had several phases. If you're a fan of Zelda lore and the enemies from the old games, I think you'll be pleased to know that some of the best things from the past make their return here, such as Goma, for instance. He's the boss of the Fire Temple. So for the nostalgia factor alone, it was great to see him and some other great enemies, and even some familiar references back in this one. In addition to the temples, there's an enormous amount of shrines you can find and complete, and they work a lot like they did in Breath of the Wild. In fact, there are 152 of them. This is an incredible amount of content, and it's honestly pretty overwhelming to me, but I couldn't help stumbling upon many of these just as I was traveling from place to place in normal gameplay. And I actually had a lot of fun in the ones I did find. One that I really liked was this one, where you enter into a huge chamber where you see a ball shooting down to the ground from high up ledges. After using the Zonai glider to get from place to place, I was able to use Ultra Hand to move some platforms around and eventually block the ball. From there I dropped the ball onto a lower ramp and moved to a different part of the shrine. From that location I was able to move the ball into a socket, which allowed me to pass by and complete the shrine. And accomplishing this gave me that instant feeling of excitement that was always present in the Zelda games. The whole experience was a lot of fun, and the fact that these shrines aren't too long and cumbersome really makes them interesting. They're really a lot more bite-sized and much less daunting than the temples are. The soundtrack is an environmental ambient style that differs quite a bit from the old school Zelda games. The fully orchestrated songs feature lots of horns and winds, but I also noticed that many of them use saxophones and pianos as well, and that part was a bit unexpected. It's a pretty diverse score, with the boss tracks being much more intense than the other ones. So if you're looking primarily for the melodic-driven songs from the retro Zelda games, you won't find them here, but there is one exception. I would say that the main theme still gives me those vibes, and that one's my favorite. The story in Tears of the Kingdom takes place sometime after Link defeated Calamity Ganon in Breath of the Wild, and begins with Link and Zelda exploring the ruins of Hyrule. An ancient mummy within attacks them, and Link tries to stop it with the Master Sword, but it's no use and the Dark Force causes it to decay. After revealing he knows Link and Zelda's names, the monster unleashes a huge surge of a mysterious substance called gloom that throws Hyrule Castle high in the air, after which it plummets into a huge pit. Link fails to save Zelda from falling into it, and has saved himself only through a mysterious mechanical arm that's been grafted into his own when he awakens. I won't spoil any of the story outside of the intro, but I will say that the history of Hyrule plays prominently in the story, and that fact kept me intrigued throughout the adventure. So I think if you go into Tears of the Kingdom skeptical that a new Zelda game can tie into the classic lore, you'll actually be pleasantly surprised. Because he was featured in the trailer, I also don't think it's spoiling anything to note that Ganon plays a big role here as well, and I think it's safe to say most fans will be pleased with how he's used in this one. Besides that, there are also many other ties into the world of The Legend of Zelda that we all know and love. The mere fact that the temples were elemental based, for instance, was a callback to some of the old Zelda games that did that, like Ocarina of Time. Also, several of the locations in the game are also throwbacks to places in the previous entries. So from the testimony of this old school Zelda fanatic, I would say that there are great touches that made the game more approachable and accessible to me than it otherwise would have been. Which other classic Zelda references and tie-ins did you catch? Let me know in the comments. So that's the aspect of Tears of the Kingdom that surprised me the most. The story is actually relatively involved, at least compared with many of the recent Zelda entries, with lots of good lore and dialogue that ties into the Zelda games of the past. There's a lot more story sequences than I expected, and it's certainly a more story-driven game than I remember Breath of the Wild ever being. I'd say the voice acting is of high quality too, and it all flowed pretty well. For some reason, I did think the voice actor for Rauru was a little bit out of place, and that his voice didn't really match the character, at least in my own sense, but that's the only critique I would make. Now there is one thing I have to admit about Tears of the Kingdom, and it actually applies to Breath of the Wild too. I was a little fearful that the Dark Souls orientation of Zelda would make the world feel too big and aimless. And let's face it, the game is absolutely huge, but I actually found that there are a lot of ways to get from place to place quickly. The Zonai glider is my absolute favorite. It's so fun to use this contraption to travel through the sky, and it comes in extremely handy in dungeons as well. Also, you gain an ability called Ascend that lets you travel upward through solid objects to reach the top of things you're standing under. This can be used in caves, structures, buildings, and other things. All in all, travel is much less of an issue than I originally envisioned it being. For how great Tears of the Kingdom looks graphically, it's honestly pretty impressive that this game was made on the same exact hardware as its predecessor was 6 years ago. The Switch is aging, but you don't really get the sense that the game's style makes it look old, if that makes sense. The environments look breathtaking, and the game runs pretty smoothly even while displaying tons of content in the distance. The one issue though is that if you're looking at landscapes while using Ultra Hand, you'll get some serious slowdown, and that can be rough. I know some people don't like the art style very much, but I actually think it's pretty good, though I can't say I quite liked it as much as the more realistic and darker style of Twilight Princess. When it comes down to it, Tears of the Kingdom is well worth playing regardless of whether you're an old school or new school Zelda fan. It's an epic experience that feels a lot like Breath of the Wild, but at the same time it offers a completely new story and new temples, so it's enough of its own thing as well. Fans who didn't enjoy Breath of the Wild might not like it as much, but I actually think some of them will enjoy the story more in this one. As far as the other stuff goes, the gameplay is fun and innovative, the temples are well designed, and there's a ton of extras to complete in the form of the shrines. It's easy to see why this was probably the biggest hype game of the last year. I'm sorry to say it won't end up being my personal game of the year because there's just so many others I'm looking forward to, but I can totally understand those who do hold it in that regard. But I'll give it this, even in the modern era, Tears of the Kingdom still preserves, at least to some extent, the same spirit of the Zelda games we all love. And I'll defend it for that, even if it isn't exactly the same kind of Zelda game I prefer to play. So what do you think about The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom? Where do you think it ranks in terms of the other Zelda games? Let me know in a comment below. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell for more retro gaming content. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members. If you want early access to the videos I produce and other perks like they receive, please consider supporting the channel by becoming a Patreon patron or via the YouTube Join feature.